dictator by name, dictator by nature. So it is with Dictator Dan, aka Dan Andrews, aka Victoria's worst premier. Not content with running one of the most locked down, most draconian states in Australia, he has now been pictured cozying up to a who's who of tin pot dictators, ranging from the North Korean leader through to the Iranian dictator. So absurd was this that even The Guardian reported on it. Such was the absurdity of Dan Andrews attending a military parade in China, in Tiananmen Square, of all places. Dan Andrews was reportedly in China to attend various activities, which includes witnessing that parade, and engaging in photo ops with the various dictators from around the world. The military parade was a clear show of strength for China. It looked to be an attempt to send a message to China's neighbours that they should be careful, and that they should fall into line. It was also a bit of a message to the United States and its allies. Dan Andrews, not content with making a nuisance of himself in Australia, then decided to go over to this parade, not only attending the parade, but also standing in the family photo with myriad dictators, like I said, including the Iranian dictator and Vladimir Putin. Having a good relationship with China is a far cry from being used as a prop in a propaganda exercise, which is clearly what the military parade was. Clearly also, the federal government thought better of doing this, which is why the federal government didn't send a minister or even an ambassador to the military parade. But lo and behold, Dan Andrews decided to attend. But not just Dan Andrews, it was also Bob Carr, one of New South Wales premiers, who has now found himself into a useful idiot. Now, you would think that Australian leaders or former leaders would know better than this. You would think they could think twice before going along to military parades overseas, really anywhere other than with a direct ally. Furthermore, you would think they would think twice before posing next to adversaries such as Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. Now, of course, going and meeting President Xi makes perfect sense. However, being around some of the other people at the meeting, not so much. And again, to be clear, this isn't a case of being a problem being in China or meeting with President Xi, although that would be a little bit odd for a former premier to be going over there and meeting with President Xi in a personal, non-professional capacity. But that notwithstanding, there's no problem per se with going over there. The problem is Dan Andrews appearing at a propaganda event and surrounding himself with many of the other dictators. Like I said, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, the Iranian dictator, all manner of people that Australia has a rather tense relationship with. After all, Vladimir Putin is a bit of an adversary in relation to Ukraine. Kim Jong-un is clearly a nuisance, and Iran was recently found to have sponsored terror events in Australia. You would think that going over and posing in a family photo with the Iranian dictator would be something that Dan Andrews should think about. At the very least, it shows a rather clear lack of judgment. Now, of course, Labor has generally leapt to Dan Andrews' defence. For example, Jacinta Allen, who is the current Victorian Premier, said it was good for the state that Andrews, quote, is held in such high regard by the people of China, and remarked that Victoria is an old friend of China and these connections are so valuable to our state. Now let's face it, is Dan Andrews actually held in high regard? Or was he just seen as friendly and potentially as a useful idiot? I'd say it's likely to be the latter than him being held in high regard for his acumen or his particular skills. Similarly, Anthony Albanese dodged questions over this, even though Dictator Dan had helped him with his election campaign, and even though it was very clear that Anthony Albanese and Dictator Dan are personal friends. Just have a look at how Anthony Albanese obfuscated around this.
What do you think of Dan Andrews joining a line of people greeting President Xi at this parade, which includes Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un?
Well,
do you like that Dan Andrews and Bob Carr are there?
He's not meeting them. As I said the last time around, 10 years ago, Minister Ronaldson was the government's representative.
Will the Prime Minister condemn his close personal friend, Daniel Andrews, attending the Chinese Communist Party military parade alongside the presidents of Russia, North Korea and Iran?
I'm responsible for the Australian government. The Australian government did have a representative there, and the Australian government did have a representative 10 years ago.
Now, Dictator Dan was not alone. Like I said, Bob Carr was also there. And Bob Carr has turned himself into something of a useful idiot these days. This includes on matters relation to Gaza. But he was seemingly not so useful to this event to have been invited into the family photo of world leaders. It appears it's just the preferred toadies that are invited along to the photos. Now, the whole thing is really not that surprising, to be honest. People talk about the so-called far right as being a threat to democracy, often paradoxically lumping libertarians in with the far right, which always I find bemusing. But in reality, it's the Fabian socialists, the socialists who decide to infect democracy with their stupid ideas that undermine democracy and undermine its ability to function in an efficient manner. But unfortunately, the mainstream left are now wearing their true colours as dictatorial control freaks. The Fabian socialists don't just take over democracy, they then go and obfuscate and make it difficult to police them and to hold them to account. We're seeing this, for example, in Victoria, but we've also seen it with the truth tax that is being proposed at the federal level. This would involve an increase in fees for freedom of information requests, which clearly is a deterrent to lodging those FOI requests, and basically just restricts them to journalists who have deep pockets. Furthermore, the relevant legislation is being significantly tightened up in relation to freedom of information requests, which is going to make it even more difficult to actually get information, because it gives the government even more discretion to deny releasing information. It is a clear threat to democracy. It's galling that people like Anthony Albanese talk about threats to democracy or ensuring that democracy survives when he himself and his own government is undermining it. The crybullies such as Dan Andrews and Albo talk about our democracy and allege that anyone who opposes them is far right, insinuating that they are a threat to democracy. But in reality, it is the left, and what has now become the mainstream left, it appears, and the Fabian socialists that are the real threat to democracy and the real threat to individual autonomy and liberty. After all, just look at Jim Chalmers' economic reform roundtable, which is basically just a tax hike roundtable. So in essence, we've got a government that wants to tax us more and then stop us asking questions about it and stop us getting information about what they're even trying to do. It is truly appalling. It is clearly becoming a banana republic. Not even a republic, really, a banana dictatorship. That's the problem. At least Dan Andrews is in the open about it. You have to give him that. At least it appears that he's being honest. So you can let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. Do you think Dan Andrews has become a useful idiot for people like the Iranian dictator or Kim Jong-un? Or do you think Dan Andrews was just corralled into something against his knowledge, an innocent bystander who didn't really know what was going on? Let me know what you think in the comments below.